Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Story 1. Terry Missy Beavers was born on August 9, 1970, in Graham, Texas. Those who knew her growing up described a friendly girl with an infectious smile and natural charisma. She was the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them for life, a quality that would define her throughout her years. In her teens, Missy met Brandon Beavers, and the two formed a connection that would eventually lead to marriage. Their relationship blossomed in the way many small-town romances do, with shared experiences, mutual friends, and the gradual realization that they wanted to build a life together. After their wedding, Missy and Brandon settled in Midlothian and started a family. They had 3 children together, and Missy embraced motherhood with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else in her life. Friends recall how she would light up when talking about her children's accomplishments, always keeping pictures ready to share with anyone who asked. Missy was the kind of mom who was involved in everything, recalled one longtime friend. School events, sports, church activities, she wanted to be there for all of it. Her kids were her world. As a wife and mother, Missy created a home filled with warmth and activity. The Beavers household was often bustling with the energy of family life, homework at the kitchen table, weekend sporting events, and holiday gatherings that brought extended family together. While Missy found great fulfillment in her family life, her journey of personal growth continued into her 40s. Like many women who have devoted years to raising children, she began to rediscover parts of herself that had been set aside for family responsibilities. In her early 40s, Missy discovered a passion for fitness that would transform her life in unexpected ways. What began as a personal journey to improve her health evolved into something much more meaningful. She became certified as a fitness instructor and joined Camp Gladiator, an outdoor fitness program focused on building strength and community simultaneously. Those who attended Missy's classes often spoke about her unique ability to motivate people. She wasn't the drill sergeant type of instructor who intimidated participants with impossible standards. Instead, she was the encouraging voice that made you believe you could push just a little harder, reach just a little further. Missy had this way of making you feel like she was personally invested in your success, one class member later told reporters. She remembered everyone's name, knew their goals, and celebrated every little victory with them. That's rare. Her social media accounts showed a woman who had found her purpose. Posts about fitness were interspersed with inspirational quotes and genuine celebrations of her clients' achievements. In one particularly touching Facebook post from early 2016, Missy wrote, "The greatest reward in what I do isn't seeing physical transformations, though those are amazing. It's seeing people discover their own strength and realize they're capable of so much more than they believed." As her following grew, so did her impact on the community. Missy's classes became known not just for the physical workout but for the sense of belonging they fostered. People came for the exercise but stayed for the community she built. In a world that can often feel disconnected, she created a space where people felt seen and supported. Sunday, April 17, 2016, began as an ordinary spring day in Texas. The Beavers family attended church in the morning, followed by a relaxed family lunch. Weather forecasts had been predicting storms for the following day, and Missy had already begun making contingency plans for her early morning fitness class. That afternoon, Brandon prepared for a fishing trip to Mississippi with friends, a trip they had planned for some time. As he packed his gear, Missy moved between helping their youngest daughter with homework and checking weather updates on her phone. She was just her normal self, Brandon would later recall to investigators. making sure everyone had what they needed, planning for the week ahead, multitasking like she always did. Around 4 p.m., Missy posted on Facebook to inform her Camp Gladiator participants that due to the expected rainfall, the Monday 5 a.m. class would be held indoors at Creekside Church of Christ rather than at the usual outdoor location. The church had previously allowed her to use their space during inclement weather, and she had already arranged for access to the building. Throughout the evening, she exchanged text messages with several class members confirming the location change and encouraging them to bring their indoor workout gear. In one message sent at 8:12 p.m., she wrote, "Don't let the rain be an excuse to skip. I've got a great indoor workout planned. See you bright and early." As the evening progressed, Brandon finished his packing and spent some time with the family before his planned early departure. The couple's 3 daughters, aged 15, 13, and 8 at the time, were engaged in their typical Sunday evening routines, finishing homework, preparing for the school week ahead, and enjoying the last moments of weekend freedom. Around 10 p.m., Missy began setting out her workout clothes and equipment for the following morning. She charged her phone and set her alarm for 4 a.m., knowing she would need to arrive at the church early to set up for her class. She and Brandon said their goodbyes, not knowing it would be the last time they spoke. He planned to leave for his fishing trip around 3 a.m., while she would be waking up just an hour later to prepare for her class. Before going to bed, Missy made one final post to the Camp Gladiator Facebook group, "Weather won't stop us. See you at Creekside Church at 5 a.m. Bring your A game." The message reflected her unwavering commitment to her fitness community, a commitment that would place her in the path of danger just hours later. As Missy fell asleep that night in her Midlothian home, surrounded by family photos and the comfortable trappings of a life well lived, she had no way of knowing that the next morning would be her last. The decisions made that evening, to move the class indoors, to arrive early to set up, to post her location publicly, would unintentionally create the circumstances for what was to come. The early hours of Monday, April 18, 2016, were quiet in Midlothian, Texas. As predicted, rain had begun to fall, creating a gentle percussion on rooftops throughout the sleeping community. Most residents wouldn't be awake for hours yet, but in the Beavers household, movement had already begun. Around 3 a.m., Brandon Beavers quietly left for his fishing trip to Mississippi, careful not to wake anyone as he departed. Just an hour later, at 4 a.m., Missy's alarm sounded in the darkness. She rose quietly, moving through her familiar morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to early starts. As you continue to listen to the rainfall in the background, imagine Missy moving through her silent house that morning. She would have dressed in her workout clothes, perhaps made a quick breakfast, and gathered her fitness equipment. Her 3 daughters remained asleep as she prepared to leave, not knowing they wouldn't see their mother again. The drive from the Beavers' home to Creekside Church of Christ would have taken approximately 15 minutes through the pre-dawn streets of Midlothian. The church itself was a modern building located in a quiet area of town. Its numerous entrances and long hallways would normally be bustling with activity on Sundays, but at 4:30 a.m. on a Monday, Missy expected to find it empty. Phone records would later confirm that Missy sent a text message at 4:16 a.m. to one of her regular class participants who had mentioned possibly running late, assuring them that it was no problem. This message, sent while she was likely driving to the church, would be her last communication. Security footage from a nearby business would later place her car approaching the church vicinity at approximately 4:18 a.m., right on schedule to give her plenty of time to set up before her 5 a.m. class. The rain continued to fall steadily as she parked her vehicle and gathered her equipment. What Missy couldn't have known as she approached the church building was that she was not the first person to arrive that morning. Someone else had already been inside the building for nearly half an hour. At 5 a.m., the first participants for Missy's Camp Gladiator class began to arrive at Creekside Church. The mood was casual, people greeting each other through yawns, commenting on the rainfall, and preparing for their workout. The church doors were unlocked as expected, but there was no sign of Missy's usual enthusiastic welcome. At first, no one was particularly concerned. They assumed she might be setting up equipment in another part of the building or perhaps had stepped away momentarily. As the minutes ticked by and more participants arrived, a subtle unease began to spread through the group. "It wasn't like her at all," one class member later told police. "Missy was always ready and waiting when we arrived, music playing, full of energy. She was the most reliable person I knew." By 5:06 a.m., concern had turned to worry, and several class members began to search the church building for their instructor. It was one of these searchers who made the devastating discovery in the main church area, Missy Beavers lying unresponsive on the floor. The peaceful morning shattered as the reality of the situation became clear. Frantic calls to 911 were made at 5:06 a.m., with the caller struggling to convey the shocking scene they had encountered. "I need an ambulance at Creekside Church," the caller told the dispatcher, voice shaking. "Our instructor, she's not breathing. I think she's been hurt. Please hurry." Emergency services responded immediately, but it was already too late. Paramedics arrived within minutes and confirmed what the class members already feared: Missy Beavers was deceased. The fitness instructor who had been so full of life and energy just the day before was gone. Police officers quickly secured the scene, establishing a perimeter around the church and beginning the painstaking process of collecting evidence. The fitness class participants, now potential witnesses, were separated and interviewed individually about what they had seen upon arrival. As dawn broke over Midlothian, the news began to spread through the community. A beloved fitness instructor and mother of 3 had been killed in a church, a sacred space meant for worship and community gathering, not violence. The Midlothian Police Department, a relatively small force unaccustomed to homicide investigations, responded with all available resources. Detective Andy Bath was assigned as lead investigator, a role that would come to define much of his career in the years to come. As crime scene technicians processed the church building, several crucial pieces of information began to emerge. The medical examiner who arrived on scene made preliminary observations about Missy's injuries. She had suffered multiple puncture wounds consistent with a weapon like a hammer or tool rather than a knife or gun. Signs of struggle were evident, suggesting Missy had fought for her life when confronted by her attacker. The time of death was initially estimated to be between 4:18 a.m., when she was believed to have arrived, and 5 a.m., when the first-class participants began to arrive. Curiously, there were no signs of sexual assault, and Missy's personal belongings, including her cell phone and jewelry, remained untouched. This immediately ruled out robbery as a primary motive, leaving investigators with more questions than answers about why someone would target the fitness instructor. As the investigation continued throughout the morning, Detective Bath made a critical decision to review the church's security footage. This decision would provide the first significant breakthrough in the case, and reveal the chilling reality that Missy's attacker had been lying in wait. The Creekside Church of Christ, like many modern buildings, was equipped with a basic security system that included several surveillance cameras. As investigators reviewed the footage from the early morning hours of April 18, they were stunned by what they discovered. The cameras had captured someone entering the church at approximately 3:50 a.m., roughly 30 minutes before Missy Beavers arrived. This wasn't a quick entry either. The footage showed the person moving methodically through the building, checking doors and exploring different areas for nearly half an hour before Missy's arrival. What made the footage particularly disturbing was the appearance of the intruder. The person was dressed in what appeared to be tactical gear reminiscent of police SWAT equipment, a black helmet with a reflective shield covering their face, a heavy vest with police markings, and dark clothing. They carried what investigators would later identify as tools, including what appeared to be a pry bar or hammer. It was immediately clear this was no random break-in, Detective Bath would later explain in a press conference. The suspect came prepared and took their time inside the building. They moved with purpose. The footage quality was typical of security cameras, grainy black and white images that captured movement but lacked fine detail. Despite these limitations, investigators could discern several notable characteristics about the suspect. Most distinctive was the person's walk, described by many who viewed the footage as having a distinctive, swinging gait or slight limp. The right foot seemed to swing outward with each step, creating a noticeable pattern of movement that experts suggested could be the result of an injury, a physical condition, or simply an idiosyncratic walking style. Analyzing the footage against known reference points in the church, investigators estimated the suspect's height to be between 5 feet 8 inches and 5 feet 10 inches. The build was difficult to determine precisely due to the bulky tactical gear, but most analysts suggested a medium build that could be consistent with either a man or a woman. This last point would become a subject of intense speculation. While most initially assumed the suspect was male, some law enforcement analysts who reviewed the footage suggested the possibility of a female perpetrator based on the person's size, movements, and proportions. The tactical gear effectively disguised identifying characteristics, making a definitive determination impossible from the video alone. As the footage continued, it showed the suspect moving through hallways, entering rooms, and at one point, using a tool to pry open an interior door. The methodical, unhurried nature of these actions suggested someone who either knew the layout of the building or was systematically exploring it. Either way, it was clear this was no opportunistic criminal who happened upon an unlocked door. The most chilling aspect of the footage was the realization that the suspect had been inside the church when Missy arrived. While no cameras captured their actual encounter, the timeline was clear. Missy arrived at approximately 4:18 a.m., and the attack must have occurred shortly thereafter. As investigators continued analyzing the evidence, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The presence of tools, including the pry bar visible in the security footage, suggested the intruder came prepared not just to enter the building but potentially to commit violence. "Everything we've seen points to this being planned," Assistant Chief Kevin Johnson told reporters several days into the investigation. "This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a chance encounter. The suspect was in the building waiting." This conclusion raised the most troubling question of all: how did the attacker know Missy would be there? The decision to hold the fitness class at the church had been made just the day before due to weather forecasts. Missy had announced the location change on social media and through text messages to her fitness class participants, but this was less than 12 hours before the murder. Investigators now had to consider several possibilities. Either the suspect was someone who followed Missy's social media or was part of her fitness community, or they had been stalking her movements closely enough to know her change of plans. Another theory emerged that perhaps the church itself was the target, and Missy's arrival was unexpected by the intruder, leading to a confrontation that turned violent. However, this theory was weakened by the fact that nothing appeared to have been taken from the church, and no vandalism was reported. The tactical police gear worn by the suspect added another layer of mystery. Was this someone attempting to impersonate law enforcement? Was the outfit chosen specifically to disguise the suspect's identity and build? Or was there some other significance to the choice of attire? Investigators were also struck by the suspect's comfort moving through the building. The unhurried pace, the methodical checking of doors, and the apparent familiarity with the layout all suggested someone who either knew the church or had scouted it previously. By the end of the first day of investigation, police had determined several key facts. The attack appeared to be planned rather than random. The suspect had entered the building approximately 30 minutes before Missy arrived. The suspect was disguised in tactical police-like gear. Nothing appeared to have been stolen from either the church or from Missy. The murder weapon was believed to be a hammer or similar tool. What they still lacked was any clear motive or identity for the killer. In the days following Missy Beaver's murder, Midlothian transformed from a quiet Dallas suburb into the center of an intense criminal investigation. The Midlothian Police Department, recognizing the complexity of the case, formed a task force that included investigators from their department, the Texas Rangers, and consultants from the FBI. The security footage was released to the public on April 20, just 2 days after the murder. Police hoped that someone might recognize the suspect's distinctive walk or provide information about the tactical gear. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, over 1,200 tips had poured in from across the country. "We appreciated the public's engagement," Detective Bath would later reflect. But sorting through that volume of information created its own challenges. We had to verify and follow up on each credible lead, and that takes time and resources. Among the physical evidence collected at the scene were several shoe prints believed to belong to the suspect. Analysis suggested they came from a distinctive type of tactical boot, size 8 to 10, which could be worn by either a man or a woman. Investigators began checking local retailers and online vendors that sold similar boots, hoping to identify recent purchases. The tactical gear itself became another focus of the investigation. Experts analyzed the footage to determine if the equipment was authentic police gear or commercially available imitations. The conclusion was that while the gear appeared professional, it was possible to purchase similar items through various tactical supply companies or online retailers. As tips continued to flood in, a dedicated team worked to categorize and prioritize them. Many were well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful, reports of suspicious persons that didn't match the time frame or descriptions of individuals whose alibis were quickly confirmed. Others required more thorough investigation, sending detectives across Texas and neighboring states to conduct interviews and verify information. In any murder investigation, those closest to the victim are often the first to be scrutinized. In Missy's case, this meant her family underwent intense examination, even as they grieved her loss. Brandon Beavers, Missy's husband, was in Mississippi on a fishing trip at the time of the murder, an alibi confirmed by his companions and supported by cell phone records, receipts, and security footage from gas stations along his route. Despite this solid alibi, online speculation about his possible involvement persisted, an unfortunate reality of high-profile cases in the social media age. "The hardest part was dealing with people's assumptions," Brandon later told a reporter. "I lost my wife, my children lost their mother, and at the same time, we had to deal with rumors and accusations. It was devastating." Other family members and close associates were similarly investigated and cleared. Detectives examined Missy's personal and professional relationships, looking for any conflicts or tensions that might explain the violence of her death. Co-workers, fitness clients, friends, and extended family members were interviewed, their whereabouts at the time of the murder verified. Investigators also explored whether Missy's work as a fitness instructor might have connected her to someone who harbored ill intentions. Had she rejected someone's advances? Had a client become inappropriately attached to her? The public nature of her role meant she interacted with dozens of people each week, making this a complex avenue to explore. What became increasingly clear was that this crime didn't fit the pattern of a random act of violence. The planning involved, the specific targeting of Missy, and the lack of sexual assault or robbery all pointed to a crime of personal motivation rather than opportunity. As weeks passed, the suspect's tactical outfit continued to fascinate both investigators and the public. Every detail was analyzed for potential significance: the helmet that obscured the face, the vest with police markings, the dark clothing that disguised the body's shape. Some law enforcement experts who reviewed the footage noted that the gear appeared oversized on the suspect's frame, leading to speculation that it might have been deliberately chosen to disguise the person's build or gender. Others pointed out that the outfit could serve a psychological purpose: people are naturally inclined to trust and comply with those who appear to be authority figures. One detail that generated significant discussion was the question of the suspect's gender. While initial reports had assumed the perpetrator was male, detailed analysis of the movement patterns, body proportions, and size led some experts to suggest the possibility of a female suspect. When you look closely at the way the person moves, there are some characteristics that could be consistent with a female gait, noted one body language expert consulted by investigators. But the gear is deliberately disguising, so it's impossible to be certain from the footage alone. This observation opened new avenues for investigation, as detectives began to consider whether they might be looking for a woman rather than a man, a significant shift in perspective that could explain why obvious suspects hadn't emerged. The disguise was almost too perfect. By concealing identifying features so thoroughly, the suspect had created a situation where countless individuals could potentially match the limited description. This made the distinctive walk one of the few truly identifying characteristics investigators had to work with. As you continue to listen to the gentle rainfall, let's explore how the investigation expanded in the months that followed, as detectives pursued digital forensics and explored connections that might have been missed initially. As the case progressed from days into weeks, investigators increasingly turned to digital evidence. In our connected world, people leave electronic footprints everywhere they go, and detectives hoped these invisible traces might lead them to Missy's killer. Missy's cell phone, recovered at the scene, provided a wealth of information. Forensic analysts examined her call logs, text messages, emails, and social media activity in the weeks and months leading up to her death. They were particularly interested in any communications that might indicate she felt threatened or noticed someone paying unusual attention to her movements. Digital evidence is crucial in modern investigations, explained one FBI consultant who assisted with the case. People reveal things in texts and online that they might never say out loud. We look for patterns, anomalies, anything that doesn't fit the normal routine. Her social media accounts, particularly her fitness-related posts, received special scrutiny. Investigators compiled a list of everyone who had interacted with her posts announcing the location change for the Monday morning class. They then cross-referenced this list against people who had regular access to Creekside Church, people with criminal histories, and individuals who had been flagged through tips. Surveillance footage from businesses near the church was collected and analyzed, hoping to capture the suspect's vehicle arriving or departing. However, the limited number of cameras in the area and the early morning timing made this effort largely unsuccessful. Most businesses either didn't have external cameras or didn't have systems that recorded during overnight hours. Detectives also examined Missy's computer, looking through her browsing history and email for any clues that might have been missed. While nothing immediately suspicious emerged, the volume of data required weeks of methodical analysis. In May 2016, approximately 1 month into the investigation, an unusual lead emerged. Detectives discovered that someone had been viewing Missy's LinkedIn profile repeatedly in the weeks before her death. LinkedIn, being a professional networking platform, wasn't typically associated with stalking behavior, making this discovery particularly intriguing. Unlike some social media platforms, LinkedIn notifies users when someone views their profile but doesn't always reveal the viewer's identity unless they have a premium account. Investigators couldn't determine if Missy had been aware of these repeated views or if she had known who was looking at her professional information. Obtaining records from LinkedIn required legal processes, including subpoenas and court orders. Even with these records, the investigation faced challenges due to the platform's privacy features and the possibility that viewers might have used anonymous browsing options or created fake accounts. This digital thread was tantalizing but ultimately difficult to follow to a conclusive end. It suggested someone had taken a specific interest in Missy's professional life, but without being able to identify who had viewed her profile, investigators couldn't determine if this was connected to her murder or merely coincidental. Digital footprints can be frustratingly incomplete, noted one cyber forensics expert who commented on the case. People know how to hide their tracks online, use VPNs, create throwaway accounts. What looks like a promising lead can vanish into the digital ether. Despite these challenges, investigators continue to pursue every digital angle, hoping that electronic breadcrumbs might eventually lead them to the person responsible for Missy's death. By June 2016, as the investigation entered its third month, police released information about a vehicle of interest that had been captured on surveillance footage near the church around the time of the murder. The car was described as a 2010 to 2012 Nissan Altima or similar sedan, dark in color. This vehicle had been spotted on security cameras from a business approximately 2 miles from the church, driving in the area between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., hours before the murder. While not directly tied to the crime scene, the timing made it suspicious enough to warrant public attention. Assistant Chief Johnson emphasized during a press conference that they weren't calling it a suspect vehicle, merely a car whose driver might have information relevant to the investigation. "We're asking anyone who recognizes this vehicle or knows who might have been driving in that area during those hours to contact us," he stated. Enhanced still images from the video were released to local media, showing a sedan moving through the frame of a distant security camera. The quality was poor, typical of surveillance footage, especially from older systems, but investigators hoped someone might recognize the vehicle. Despite this public appeal and the circulation of the images, the car lead ultimately failed to produce concrete results. The vehicle was never definitively identified, and its connection to the case remained speculative. As summer turned to fall, the investigation continued but with diminishing new evidence. The Midlothian Police Department insisted the case remained active and a priority, but the reality of modern police work meant resources had to be allocated to other crimes as well. For the Beavers family and the Midlothian community, the lack of resolution was becoming its own form of torment. As months passed without an arrest, both investigators and the public began developing theories about the crime. The most prevalent theory, and the one that aligned best with the evidence, was that Missy had been specifically targeted by someone with a personal motivation. The evidence supporting this theory was substantial. The perpetrator had entered the church well before Missy arrived and waited for her. They came prepared with tools and disguised in tactical gear that concealed their identity. Nothing was stolen, and the church itself wasn't vandalized, suggesting Missy herself was the focus. What remained unclear was the nature of the personal motivation. Was it jealousy? Revenge? Obsession? Had Missy unknowingly angered someone to the point of violence? Or was she being punished for something someone believed she had done? One investigative angle explored whether Missy might have been aware of information that someone wanted to keep secret. As a fitness instructor who formed close relationships with many clients, she might have been privy to personal confessions or observations that could have been dangerous if revealed. The financial aspect of Missy's life was also examined. While the Beavers family appeared to be comfortably middle class, no unusual financial transactions or suspicious windfalls were discovered that might suggest a money-related motive. What made this theory particularly challenging to prove was that it required identifying someone with both the motive to harm Missy and the capability to carry out such a carefully planned attack. Despite hundreds of interviews and exhaustive background checks on people in Missy's life, no obvious candidate emerged. A second theory proposed that Missy might not have been the intended target at all. Perhaps the perpetrator had been planning to attack someone else who regularly used the church building and encountered Missy unexpectedly. This theory gained some traction when investigators learned that multiple groups and individuals had access to the church at various times. Church staff, maintenance workers, other community groups, and individuals who borrowed the space for events all came and went throughout the week. The layout of the church, with its multiple entrances and confusing hallways, made it possible that the perpetrator might have been disoriented or confused about exactly where they were in the building when they encountered Missy. Some speculated that the church itself might have been the actual target, perhaps by someone with a grievance against the congregation or its leadership. However, this theory was weakened by the lack of any attack on church property or symbols. The mistaken identity theory faced significant challenges when considering the timing. If the perpetrator wasn't targeting Missy specifically, why enter the building at 3:50 a.m.? And how would they have known anyone would be there at all at such an early hour unless they were aware of Missy's scheduled class? While investigators never completely dismissed this possibility, the evidence increasingly pointed toward Missy herself being the intended target rather than a victim of circumstance. In the vacuum of official information, public speculation flourished, particularly online, where amateur sleuths dissected every available piece of evidence. One theory that gained significant attention involved Randy Beavers, Missy's father-in-law. This speculation began after some viewers of the security footage claimed to notice similarities between the suspect's distinctive walking gait and Randy Beavers' walk. Side-by-side video comparisons circulated online, with people highlighting what they perceived as matching movement patterns. The theory gained enough traction that police were forced to address it directly. Investigators confirmed that they had examined this possibility thoroughly, as they had with all family connections. Randy Beavers had been in California at the time of the murder, a fact verified through multiple forms of evidence including credit card transactions, witness statements, and travel records. Despite the public clearing of Randy Beavers, the theory persisted in online forums and social media discussions, causing additional pain to a family already struggling with their loss. The internet can be incredibly cruel, noted one victim advocate who worked with the Beavers family. These aren't just theories to them, it's their lives, their loved ones being discussed by strangers who don't have all the facts. The focus on Randy Beavers highlighted a problematic aspect of high-profile unsolved cases. The court of public opinion often operates without the rigorous standards of evidence required in actual legal proceedings, causing real harm to innocent people caught in its speculation. As we reach the end of our exploration of this case, the gentle rain continues to fall, much as it did on that April morning in 2016. Today, more than 7 years after Missy Beavers' death, her case remains officially unsolved. The Midlothian Police Department maintains that the investigation remains active. Detective Andy Bath, who has stayed with the case since the beginning, continues to follow up on new leads as they emerge, though they are fewer with each passing year. A $50,000 reward still stands for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. Periodically, police release updated statements, assuring the public that they continue to pursue justice for Missy and closure for her family. The impact of Missy's death on Midlothian has been profound and lasting. The community that once felt insulated from serious crime now lives with the knowledge that an unsolved murder remains in their midst. Parents are more cautious, buildings are more secure, and a collective innocence has been lost. For Brandon Beavers and the couple's 3 daughters, life has continued, but always with the shadow of unanswered questions. The children have grown older, milestones that Missy should have been present to witness passing without her. Brandon has worked to keep her memory alive for their daughters while helping them move forward with their lives. Missy would have wanted them to live fully, a family friend shared in a local newspaper interview on the 5th anniversary of her death. She put so much energy into making sure they had opportunities and experiences. That's what the family tries to focus on, honoring her by living the way she would have wanted them to. The Camp Gladiator community has also kept Missy's memory alive. Annual memorial workouts are held in her honor, with proceeds going to charitable causes that reflect her values. Former clients speak of her lasting impact on their lives, not just physically through fitness but through the confidence and sense of community she helped them discover. As you drift toward sleep, consider the ripples that spread from a single life. Though Missy Beavers' time was cut short, her influence continues through the lives she touched, her children, her friends, her fitness community. In that way, something of her spirit endures despite the tragic circumstances of her death. The rain continues to fall, both in our story and in the sound surrounding you now. In Midlothian, Texas, someone still holds the answer to what happened that April morning. Perhaps one day, a new piece of evidence will emerge, a witness will come forward, or a confession will be made. Until then, Missy's case remains one of those mysteries that reminds us how fragile life can be and how precious our connections to others truly are. Rest now, knowing that while some stories lack neat conclusions, the human spirit's capacity for remembrance ensures that those we've lost are never truly gone. Their stories, like Missy's, continue to be told, ensuring that the search for truth and justice persists even as time passes. If you're still awake and listening, I hope this exploration of this case has been informative while also providing a soothing background for sleep. Please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tara Lee Calico was born on February 16, 1969, in the small town of Belen, New Mexico. If you're not familiar with Belen, it's a quiet community of just over 7,000 people, situated about 30 miles south of Albuquerque. The name Belen comes from the Spanish word for Bethlehem, and the town is often called the hub city because it serves as a major transportation center in the region. Growing up in Belen during the 1970s and 80s, Tara experienced the kind of small-town upbringing that many would consider quintessentially American. The landscape around Belen is striking, the Rio Grande flows nearby, and the town sits in a valley between mesas and mountains. The high desert landscape is characterized by expansive blue skies, dramatic sunsets, and air so clear you can see for miles. Tara's family home was comfortable and loving. Her mother, Patty Dole, and her stepfather, John Dole, created a stable environment for Tara and her younger brother, Chris. By all accounts, the Dole household was a happy one, filled with the normal routines and minor dramas of family life. John had become Tara's stepfather when she was a young child, and by all accounts, their relationship was close and supportive. As Tara grew into adolescence and then young adulthood, she revealed herself to be bright, athletic, and determined. She was a good student at Belen High School, where she developed a particular interest in science. Those who knew her described Tara as intelligent but humble, someone who worked hard without drawing attention to herself. Standing at 5 feet 7 inches with a slender athletic build, Tara had striking features, warm brown eyes and shoulder-length brown hair that she often wore pulled back when she was playing tennis or riding her bike, two activities she particularly enjoyed. Her smile was frequently commented on by those who knew her, a genuine expression that seemed to light up her entire face. Beyond her academic pursuits, Tara was passionate about sports and outdoor activities. She was particularly fond of tennis and played on the Belen High School team. But perhaps her greatest love was cycling. The freedom and solitude of long bike rides appealed to Tara's independent nature, and she often took extended rides through the countryside surrounding Belen. By 1988, Tara had graduated from high school and was continuing her education at the University of New Mexico's Valencia campus, not far from her home. At 19 years old, she was living at home while attending college, a common arrangement that allowed her to save money while pursuing her education. She was studying psychology and had expressed interest in eventually becoming a psychologist, a career path that seemed well suited to her empathetic nature and analytical mind. Those who knew Tara in those days described her as someone who was on the cusp of adulthood, with all the excitement and uncertainty that entails. She had a steady boyfriend, with whom she seemed happy. She enjoyed spending time with a close circle of friends, many of whom she had known since childhood. At the same time, she valued her independence and personal space. One particularly telling aspect of Tara's personality was her routine. She was, by nature, methodical and consistent. This was especially evident in her exercise habits. Tara rode her bike almost daily, following established routes through the rural roads surrounding Belen. She was in excellent physical condition and could easily handle rides of 20 miles or more. These bicycle rides became a central part of Tara's routine. Initially, her mother would accompany her on these outings, the two of them pedaling side by side along the quiet country roads. But in the months leading up to her disappearance, Tara had begun riding alone. This wasn't due to any friction between mother and daughter, rather, it was a natural progression as Tara asserted her independence. However, these solo rides were not without concern. Patty had warned her daughter about potential dangers on the isolated roads. There had been reports of a driver in a pickup truck harassing female joggers and cyclists in the area. Nothing violent had occurred, but the behavior was concerning enough that Patty advised Tara to be cautious. In response to these concerns, Tara developed a system. She would tell her mother exactly which route she planned to take and when she expected to return. If she wasn't back by the agreed-upon time, her mother should come looking for her. It was a sensible precaution that reflected both Tara's responsible nature and the reality that even in a seemingly safe small town, potential dangers existed. September of 1988 found Tara settling into her college routine while maintaining her active lifestyle. She was looking forward to playing in a tennis tournament later that month. Her relationship with her boyfriend was going well. She continued to enjoy her bicycle rides through the New Mexico countryside, often listening to her portable cassette player as she pedaled along the familiar routes. There was nothing in Tara's demeanor or circumstances that suggested anything was amiss. No conflicts with friends or family, no unusual behavior, no expressed fears or concerns. She was, by all accounts, a young woman with a bright future ahead of her, following the paths she had thoughtfully laid out for herself. And so we come to September 20th, 1988, a day that began like any other in the Dole household, but would end with a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The morning of Tuesday, September 20th, 1988, dawned clear and mild in Belen, New Mexico. It was a typical late summer day in the high desert, with the promise of warmth as the sun rose higher but pleasant enough in the early hours for outdoor activities. Tara woke early, as was her habit. She had a busy day ahead, classes at the University of New Mexico's Valencia campus and preparation for an upcoming tennis tournament. But before all that, she planned to fit in her regular morning bike ride. The house was quiet as Tara dressed in her cycling clothes, pink shorts, a white t-shirt, white socks, and white and blue tennis shoes. She gathered her things, including her Sony Walkman cassette player. The cassette inside was one of her favorites, a mix of Boston songs she'd recorded herself. Music was an important part of Tara's cycling routine, helping her maintain her rhythm and making the solitary rides more enjoyable. Before leaving, Tara spoke briefly with her mother, Patty. She outlined her planned route, a 36-mile round trip along Highway 47, a stretch of road she knew well. She told her mother she'd be back by noon to make it to her university class. This was typical of Tara, specific about her plans, conscious of time, responsible about communicating her whereabouts. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Tara wheeled her pink Huffy mountain bike out of the garage and set off. The bike was distinctive, not just for its color but also for the yellow reflector tape that Tara had applied to the frame. She had added this safety feature to make herself more visible to passing vehicles. As she pedaled away from the house, Tara likely had no inkling that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be the beginning of one of New Mexico's most enduring mysteries. Her mother watched her daughter disappear down the street, not knowing that this would be the last time she would see her. Tara's planned route would take her south along Highway 47, a two-lane road that runs parallel to the Rio Grande through Valencia County. The highway passes through agricultural areas and small communities, with stretches that are relatively isolated. Traffic on a weekday morning would have been light, mostly local residents going about their business and the occasional truck. The landscape along Highway 47 is quintessential New Mexico: vast blue skies overhead, the valley of the Rio Grande to the west, and the Manzano Mountains rising to the east. The terrain is mostly flat along this stretch, making it suitable for cycling, though there are few shoulders in some sections, requiring cyclists to share the main roadway with motor vehicles. As Tara rode south, several witnesses would later report seeing her. A Valencia County Sheriff's deputy passed her on the highway around 10 a.m., noting nothing unusual. She appeared to be riding normally, listening to her Walkman as she pedaled. This sighting placed her about 15 miles south of her home. Another witness, a male carrier who knew Tara by sight, also saw her that morning. He would later tell investigators that he observed a light-colored pickup truck following behind her at some distance. This detail would take on significant importance in the hours and days to come. The last confirmed sighting of Tara came at approximately 11:45 a.m. A rancher who lived along Highway 47 noticed a young woman on a pink bicycle passing by his property. He didn't know Tara personally but was able to provide a description that matched her appearance. This placed her about 2 miles from her home, seemingly on her return journey. And then, nothing. Noon came and went, and Tara did not return home. Initially, her mother wasn't overly concerned. Tara might have lost track of time or experienced a minor delay. But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of her daughter, Patty's worry began to grow. By 1 p.m., with Tara now an hour overdue and missing her college class, Patty decided to go looking for her. She got in her car and drove the route that Tara had outlined that morning. She proceeded south on Highway 47, scanning the roadsides carefully, looking for any sign of her daughter or her pink bicycle. Finding nothing, Patty returned home, hoping that perhaps she and Tara had somehow missed each other. But the house was empty, and Tara's tennis racket still sat where she had left it that morning. Now truly alarmed, Patty called the Valencia County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. The sheriff's deputies responded promptly, taking the report and beginning their own search along Highway 47. By late afternoon, family, friends, and neighbors had joined the effort, forming an impromptu search party that combed the roadsides and adjacent fields. As daylight began to fade on that September evening, there was still no sign of Tara Calico or her distinctive pink bicycle. No abandoned bicycle by the roadside, no articles of clothing, no cassette player, nothing to indicate what might have happened to the 19-year-old college student during her morning ride. That night, as darkness fell over the Dole household, a family confronted the first hours of what would become an unimaginable ordeal. The disappearance of a beloved daughter, sister, and friend vanished without explanation from a familiar road on an ordinary September morning. As the first 24 hours after Tara's disappearance passed, the initial concern evolved into a full-scale search and investigation. The Valencia County Sheriff's Office mobilized all available resources, coordinating with the New Mexico State Police to expand the search effort. Deputies retraced Tara's route multiple times, this time moving more slowly and methodically. They searched ditches, culverts, and the brushy areas along Highway 47. They knocked on doors of homes and businesses along the route, asking if anyone had seen Tara on that Tuesday morning. Meanwhile, family and friends organized their own search parties, combing areas that might have been overlooked by law enforcement. Posters with Tara's photograph and description were printed and distributed throughout Belen and neighboring communities. Local media began to cover the story, spreading awareness of the missing young woman. The investigation quickly focused on the light-colored pickup truck that had been reported following Tara. Investigators attempted to identify the vehicle and its driver, but with only a vague description to go on, this proved challenging. There were many light-colored trucks in Valencia County, and without a license plate number or more specific details, narrowing down the possibilities was difficult. In those early days, various theories emerged about what might have happened to Tara. Had she been struck by a vehicle and the driver had panicked and hidden her body? Had she been abducted? Had she met with foul play at the hands of someone she knew, or had she been the victim of a random act of violence? One theory that investigators considered was that Tara might have been harassed or followed by the same individual who had reportedly bothered other female joggers and cyclists in the area. This line of inquiry led them to question several local men who owned trucks matching the general description, but these interviews yielded no concrete leads. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded to include more remote areas of Valencia County. Abandoned buildings, seldom used dirt roads, and desert ravines were all searched. Helicopters flew over the more inaccessible terrain, looking for any sign of Tara or her bicycle. The FBI became involved in the case, providing additional resources and expertise. They helped create a more detailed profile of the circumstances surrounding Tara's disappearance and assisted in following up on the increasing number of tips that were coming in from the public. Throughout this period, the Dole family maintained a steadfast presence in the search efforts. John and Patty Dole spent countless hours distributing flyers, talking to media, and consulting with law enforcement. They established a reward fund for information leading to Tara's whereabouts. They refused to give up hope that their daughter would be found. The community response was overwhelming. Belen was the kind of place where people looked out for one another, and the disappearance of one of their own mobilized residents in remarkable ways. Volunteers provided food and drinks for search parties. Local businesses donated printing services for flyers and posters. Churches held prayer vigils. The collective hope was that Tara would be found alive and well, perhaps injured but surviving somewhere, waiting for rescue. But as the weeks stretched on with no sign of Tara, that hope began to dim. The lack of evidence was both baffling and frustrating. No personal items had been found, not her bicycle, not her Walkman, not the yellow Sony sports earphones she had been wearing, not even a piece of clothing. It was as if Tara had simply vanished into thin air along that stretch of Highway 47. The absence of physical evidence complicated the investigation immensely. Without a crime scene, without recovered items that might bear fingerprints or other trace evidence, investigators had little to work with beyond witness statements and theories. One significant challenge was the terrain itself. The area along Highway 47 includes not only the road and its immediate surroundings but also vast stretches of sparsely populated land. The high desert environment of central New Mexico features arroyos, dry creek beds, mesas, and brushy areas that could potentially conceal evidence for years. Despite the extensive searches, the possibility remained that crucial items had been overlooked. As the investigation continued, investigators began to look more closely at Tara's personal life. They interviewed her boyfriend, her college classmates, and other acquaintances, seeking any information that might shed light on her disappearance. By all accounts, Tara had no enemies, no concerning relationships, no involvement in risky activities. She was described consistently as responsible, cautious, and level-headed. The case began to garner attention beyond New Mexico. National media picked up the story, and Tara's disappearance was featured on television programs dedicated to missing persons cases. Each new round of publicity brought a fresh batch of tips and potential leads, all of which had to be carefully investigated, consuming precious law enforcement resources. By the end of 1988, the active search for Tara had been scaled back, though the investigation remained open. The Dole family had endured 3 months of agonizing uncertainty, with the holiday season offering little comfort as they faced the first Christmas without Tara. And then, in June of 1989, 9 months after Tara's disappearance, a discovery hundreds of miles away would add a bizarre and unsettling twist to the already mysterious case. On June 15, 1989, in a convenience store parking lot in Port St. Joe, Florida, nearly 1,600 miles from Belen, New Mexico, a woman noticed something unusual on the ground as she was leaving the store. It was a Polaroid photograph, and what it showed disturbed her enough that she picked it up and later turned it over to the local police. The Polaroid depicted two people, a young woman and a younger boy or adolescent male, both bound and gagged, lying on what appeared to be rumpled bedding in the back of what might have been a van or similar vehicle. Both individuals had duct tape over their mouths and appeared to be restrained in some way. Their eyes were open and seemed to convey distress. When Port St. Joe police examined the photograph, they determined it had been recently taken. Polaroid film develops quickly after the picture is ejected from the camera, and the photo appeared to be relatively fresh, suggesting it might have been dropped in the parking lot not long before it was found. The woman who found the photograph told police that she had noticed a white Toyota cargo van with a man inside it parked in the same lot. She described the driver as a mustached man in his 30s with dirty, sandy blonde hair. By the time the significance of the van was realized, it had departed, and no license plate number had been recorded. When the Polaroid was made public, it quickly caught the attention of investigators working on missing persons cases. The young woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Tara Calico. She had similar hair color and facial features. More compelling still, next to her on what looked like the van's floor was what appeared to be a copy of V.C. Andrews' novel, My Sweet Audrina, a book that Tara was known to have been reading around the time of her disappearance. When the Polaroid was shown to Patty Dole, she identified the young woman as her daughter with near certainty. She pointed to specific features, a scar on the woman's leg that matched one Tara had received in a car accident, and what appeared to be the outline of a book beside her that could have been My Sweet Audrina. The boy in the photograph was also tentatively identified as Michael Henley, a 9-year-old who had disappeared in April 1988 while on a hunting trip with his father in the Zuni Mountains of New Mexico. The Henley family believed the boy in the photo was their son. The discovery of this Polaroid ignited new hope and simultaneously new anguish for the families of both missing persons. If the individuals in the photograph were indeed Tara and Michael, it suggested they might still be alive, but in dangerous circumstances. FBI analysis of the photograph produced inconclusive results. Some experts believed the young woman was Tara, while others were less certain. The same was true for the identification of the boy as Michael Henley. The technical limitations of forensic photo analysis in 1989, combined with the small size and somewhat blurry quality of the Polaroid, made definitive identification impossible. The discovery of the Polaroid sparked a renewed investigation. Law enforcement in Florida attempted to locate the white van and its driver, while New Mexico authorities revisited the circumstances of Tara's disappearance with this new potential evidence in mind. The national media covered the story extensively, and the Polaroid was widely circulated in the hope that someone might recognize the location or provide information about the individuals pictured. In a cruel twist, the identification of the boy as Michael Henley was later disproven. In 1990, Michael's remains were discovered in the Zuni Mountains, not far from where he had disappeared. The medical examiner determined that he had likely died from exposure after becoming lost. This sad discovery eliminated the possibility that he was the boy in the Polaroid, further complicating the already mysterious photograph. Despite this setback, the Dole family continued to believe that the young woman in the photograph was their daughter. The timing of the discovery, the physical similarities, and the presence of what might have been Tara's book all suggested a connection. Over the years, additional Polaroid photographs surfaced, each purporting to show Tara or other missing persons. In 1992, a photo was found behind a residential parking lot in Montecito, California, showing a woman's face with her mouth covered with duct tape and her hands apparently bound. Some believe this woman might also be Tara, though again, analysis was inconclusive. A third Polaroid, found in Galveston, Texas, in 1993, showed a woman with her hands bound, along with a man on an Amtrak train. Law enforcement determined that this photograph had no connection to Tara's case. The Polaroid found in Port St. Joe remained the most compelling potential evidence in Tara's disappearance, but it also introduced more questions than answers. If it did depict Tara, who had taken her from New Mexico to Florida? What was the connection to the boy in the photograph, if not Michael Henley? Why would the perpetrator take such a risk by dropping or deliberately leaving the photograph in a public place? These questions continued to haunt investigators and the Dole family alike as the case remained unsolved. The Polaroid represented both hope that Tara might still be alive, and horror at what she might be enduring. This dual nature of the photograph made it particularly difficult for her family to process. As the 1990s progressed, Tara's case remained open but increasingly cold. The initial flurry of leads generated by the Polaroid photograph gradually dwindled, leaving investigators with few new avenues to explore. The Valencia County Sheriff's Office maintained the case file, periodically reviewing the evidence and following up on any new tips that came in. The FBI also kept Tara on their list of missing persons, with her case receiving occasional review by agents specializing in abductions and long-term missing persons investigations. Meanwhile, the Dole family continued their own tireless efforts to find answers. They worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to keep Tara's case in the public eye. Her photograph and story appeared on playing cards distributed in prisons, on billboards, and in numerous media features about unsolved disappearances. In 1993, 5 years after Tara vanished, her case was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries. The segment included reenactments of her bicycle ride and highlighted the mysterious Polaroid photograph. The broadcast generated numerous tips from viewers across the country, but none led to a breakthrough in the case. The lack of physical evidence continued to hamper the investigation. Without Tara's bicycle, her Walkman, or any personal items, forensic analysis opportunities were severely limited. The advent of DNA technology in criminal investigations during the 1990s offered new possibilities for solving cold cases, but without biological evidence to test, these advances couldn't be applied to Tara's case. Law enforcement agencies periodically re-interviewed key witnesses, hoping that the passage of time might have loosened tongues or refreshed memories. They revisited the reports of the light-colored pickup truck seen following Tara, attempting to generate new leads from this crucial piece of information. One theory that gained traction among some investigators was that Tara might have been struck by a vehicle while riding her bicycle, and the driver, possibly intoxicated or otherwise compromised, had concealed her body and the bicycle to avoid legal consequences. This would explain the complete absence of physical evidence along her route. However, this theory didn't account for the Polaroid photograph, assuming it did indeed show Tara 9 months after her disappearance. Another theory suggested that Tara had been abducted by someone who had been stalking her or monitoring her predictable cycling routine. The regular nature of her rides along the same route would have made her vulnerable to someone with malicious intent. This theory could potentially connect to the reports of harassment that other female cyclists and joggers had experienced in the area. In 2003, Patty Dole passed away, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. John Dole continued the search, though advancing age and diminishing resources made it increasingly difficult. The loss of Patty was particularly poignant, as she had been the driving force behind many of the efforts to find Tara. Law enforcement technology and techniques continued to evolve through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Cold case units became more common in police departments across the country, with detectives specially trained in reviewing old cases with fresh eyes and new methodologies. In 2008, on the 20th anniversary of Tara's disappearance, the Valencia County Sheriff's Office announced a renewed effort to solve the case. They revisited the original investigation, re-examined witness statements, and publicly appealed for anyone with information to come forward, emphasizing that it was never too late to share what they knew. This renewed attention brought the case back into the public consciousness and generated media coverage, but once again, no significant breakthroughs occurred. The case remained as mysterious as ever, a young woman on a bicycle who had seemingly vanished into thin air on a busy highway in broad daylight. Over the years, various law enforcement officials have expressed personal theories about what happened to Tara. In 2013, a retired Valencia County Sheriff's deputy who had worked on the case stated his belief that Tara had been struck by a vehicle and that her body and bicycle had been disposed of to cover up the incident. He suggested that local individuals knew what had happened but had maintained their silence for decades. Others involved in the investigation continued to believe that the Polaroid photograph did indeed show Tara, indicating that she had been abducted and transported across state lines. This would make her case a federal matter, potentially involving interstate human trafficking. As digital technology advanced, the Polaroid photograph was subjected to enhanced analysis techniques, but the results remained inconclusive. The limitations of the original photograph, its size, quality, and the degradation it had suffered over time, continued to prevent a definitive identification. Social media also changed how missing persons cases were publicized and investigated. Various online communities dedicated to true crime and unsolved mysteries took an interest in Tara's case, with amateur sleuths combing through the available information and sometimes generating new theories or perspectives. In 2017, the sheriff of Valencia County told reporters that he believed the case was solvable and that his office had persons of interest, though he declined to provide specific details. This statement suggested that law enforcement might have more information than had been publicly disclosed, perhaps out of concern for compromising a potential future prosecution. Despite these periodic announcements and the continued efforts of both official investigators and concerned citizens, Tara's case remained unsolved as it approached its 30th anniversary. The passage of time had made the investigation more challenging, with witnesses aging, memories fading, and physical evidence, if it ever existed, likely long gone. Yet the case refused to fade from public consciousness, particularly in New Mexico, where Tara's disappearance had left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the community. Her story continued to be told, her photographs still circulated, and the hope for resolution, however faint, persisted. As the investigation into Tara's disappearance extended from years into decades, numerous theories emerged about what might have happened to her on that September morning in 1988. Each theory had its proponents and detractors, with varying degrees of evidence or logical reasoning to support it. One of the earliest and most persistent theories was that Tara had been abducted by the driver of the light-colored pickup truck reported to have been following her. This theory aligned with the witness statement from the mail carrier and would explain the complete disappearance of both Tara and her bicycle. If the driver had been stalking her or seized an opportunity when finding her alone on a relatively isolated stretch of road, he could have forced her into the vehicle and concealed her bicycle. This abduction theory gained additional support when the Polaroid photograph surfaced in Florida. If the young woman in the image was indeed Tara, it suggested she had been taken across state lines by her abductor. The presence of another apparent victim in the photograph raised the disturbing possibility that the perpetrator might have been involved in multiple abductions. However, skeptics of this theory pointed out several issues. First, the abduction would have had to occur on a public highway during daylight hours, creating a risk of witnesses. Second, the Polaroid photograph's connection to Tara, while compelling, was never definitively established. Third, if Tara had been abducted and transported to Florida or elsewhere, why had no other evidence of her surfaced in more than 3 decades? An alternative theory suggested that Tara's disappearance was connected to a vehicle accident. According to this perspective, Tara might have been struck by a passing vehicle while cycling along Highway 47. The driver, potentially impaired or simply panicked, might have concealed her body and bicycle to avoid legal consequences. This would explain the complete absence of physical evidence along her route. Supporters of this theory sometimes pointed to the narrow shoulders on sections of Highway 47, which forced cyclists to ride close to traffic. They also noted that if Tara had been listening to her Walkman, she might have been less aware of approaching vehicles. Critics of the accident theory argued that it failed to account for the Polaroid photograph. If Tara had died in a traffic accident and her body had been concealed, she could not have appeared in a photograph taken months later. They also questioned how a panicked driver could have so thoroughly removed all evidence from the scene, including Tara's bicycle, personal items, and any physical traces of an accident. A third theory proposed that Tara had fallen victim to a local predator, someone familiar with the area who had observed her regular cycling routine and planned the abduction in advance. This person might have had a location already prepared to conceal Tara and her belongings. The fact that her bicycle was never found suggested that the perpetrator had the means to transport and dispose of it completely. This theory of a calculating local predator aligned with reports of other women being harassed in the area while jogging or cycling. It also could potentially connect to the Polaroid if the individual had transported Tara across state lines at some point after the abduction. Yet another possibility raised over the years was that Tara had disappeared voluntarily, that she had arranged to meet someone and had chosen to leave her life behind. However, this theory found little support among those who knew Tara or investigated her case. By all accounts, she was happy, well-adjusted, and had made specific plans for the day of her disappearance and beyond. There were no unexplained withdrawals from her bank account, no missing clothing or personal items from her room, and no communications with friends or family suggesting any desire to leave. Some investigators have also considered whether Tara's disappearance might have been a case of mistaken identity, that the perpetrator had intended to abduct someone else and had taken Tara in error. This could explain the seemingly random nature of the crime and the lack of any apparent motive connected specifically to Tara. As the decades passed and forensic science advanced, the possibility emerged that Tara's case might eventually be solved through DNA evidence. If her remains were ever found, modern techniques might be able to identify them and potentially link them to a perpetrator. Similarly, if items belonging to Tara surfaced, they might yield DNA or other forensic evidence that was not detectable at the time of her disappearance. In recent years, the role of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases has revolutionized criminal investigations. By comparing DNA evidence to commercial genealogy databases, investigators have identified perpetrators in cases that had remained unsolved for decades. However, this approach requires DNA evidence, which remains absent in Tara's case. The various theories about Tara's disappearance each have their strengths and weaknesses, and none perfectly accounts for all the known facts. This is the nature of cold cases: incomplete information, contradictory evidence, and the passage of time all complicate efforts to determine the truth. What remains beyond dispute is that a young woman with her whole life ahead of her vanished without a trace on an ordinary September morning, leaving behind a grieving family and a community haunted by unanswered questions. Whether Tara fell victim to a calculated abduction, a tragic accident followed by a cover-up, or some other unfortunate circumstance, her story continues to resonate with people who wonder, what happened to Tara Calico? If you're still awake and listening, please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Lake Placid, New York, a name forever etched in Olympic history after hosting the Winter Games twice, most memorably in 1980. But by 2007, when our story takes place, Lake Placid had settled into a quieter existence. The Olympic facilities, once bustling with athletes and spectators from around the world, had grown older, some fallen into disuse, becoming silent monuments to glories past. It was early autumn, that perfect in-between season when summer tourists have departed, their canoes and fishing rods packed away until next year, but before the winter enthusiasts arrive with their skis and snowboards. The lake waters had begun to cool, developing that crystalline clarity that comes with dropping temperatures. The surrounding Adirondack Mountains were just beginning their spectacular transformation, with patches of red and gold appearing among the deep greens of pine and spruce. Many of the summer cabins along the North Shore stood empty during this shoulder season. It's a place where cell reception comes and goes at the whim of the mountains. Where neighbors might be a quarter-mile away, hidden by dense forest and winding roads. where on still nights, sound carries across the water in strange ways, making distant conversations seem close and nearby noises impossible to locate. The locals know that while Lake Placid presents a picture-perfect postcard image to the world, the surrounding wilderness of the Adirondack Park is vast and untamed. 6 million acres of protected forest, dotted with over 3,000 lakes and ponds, countless streams, and mountains that stand like silent sentinels. Beautiful, yes, undeniably so, but also unforgiving to those who don't respect its power. It was into this setting that Vanessa Mitchell arrived, driving her dark green Subaru Outback along winding roads beneath canopies of trees just beginning to turn. She came alone, as she often did, with her cameras, her notebooks, and a project that had captured her imagination, documenting the forgotten and abandoned Olympic sites that dotted the region, places where glory had faded into quiet decay. Vanessa Mitchell was 32 years old when she checked into Cabin 7 at Whispering Pines Cabin Resort on September 17, 2007. Standing at 5'6" with auburn hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, Vanessa had the confident bearing of someone comfortable in her own company. Those who met her during her stay would later describe her as friendly but focused, the kind of person who made easy conversation but clearly had a purpose. Born and raised in western Massachusetts, Vanessa had built a successful career as a freelance photographer after studying photojournalism at Boston University. Her work regularly appeared in outdoor and travel magazines, capturing landscapes that seemed to breathe with life even on the printed page. She had a particular talent for finding beauty in abandonment, old factories, forgotten towns, places where human endeavor had retreated and nature was slowly reclaiming what was once hers. She had this way of making you see things differently, her younger sister Rebecca would later tell investigators. She'd photograph something broken and somehow make you see the story in it, the dignity. She always said that abandoned places weren't really empty, they were full of echoes. Vanessa's personal life had taken a difficult turn 3 years earlier with the dissolution of her brief marriage to fellow photographer Thomas Reed. Friends described the split as amicable but said it had left Vanessa restless, more willing to take on remote assignments that kept her on the road for weeks at a time. She had developed a reputation for being fearless, often venturing alone into areas other photographers might avoid. Her trip to Lake Placid was part of a larger project, a photography book tentatively titled, After the Games, documenting former Olympic sites around the world and how they had evolved, or devolved, in the years since their moments of glory. Lake Placid was her third stop after visits to Sarajevo and Athens. The owner of Whispering Pines, Thomas Kirkland, a former Forestry Service employee who had opened the resort after retirement, remembered checking Vanessa in. She was excited about the project, he would later recall. Asked a lot of questions about the old Olympic facilities, not just the main ones that tourists visit, but the forgotten places, the storage buildings, the maintenance areas. Places most people wouldn't even know existed. Vanessa's routine during those first few days seemed normal enough. She'd leave her cabin early, her Subaru loaded with camera equipment, return briefly in the afternoon to download images, then head out again, often not returning until after dark. She kept to herself but exchanged pleasantries with other guests when their paths crossed in the resort's small reception area where complimentary coffee was available each morning. She mentioned finding some interesting spots, said Martha Keller, a retired teacher from Albany who was staying in Cabin 5. She showed me a few photos on her camera, old equipment sheds with amazing light coming through broken windows. She seemed pleased with how the shoot was going. On September 17 through the 20th, Vanessa followed what appeared to be a productive routine. Security cameras at local businesses captured her buying groceries, stopping for coffee, and purchasing additional memory cards at the small electronics store on Main Street. Cell tower data showed regular calls to her sister Rebecca and her editor at Northwest Explorations magazine. Her last verified phone call took place at 7:24 p.m. on September 20. Rebecca Mitchell would later share the content of that conversation with authorities. She was excited about what she'd found that day, some kind of equipment storage facility near one of the old ski jumps. She said the light had been perfect, streaming through broken windows. But she also mentioned something odd, that she kept feeling like someone was watching her. I didn't think much of it at the time. Vanessa was always hyper-aware of her surroundings when working alone. Rebecca grew concerned when Vanessa didn't make her usual check-in call on September 21st. We had this system, she explained. When she was working in remote locations, she'd call every day, usually in the evening. If she couldn't call, she'd text. If neither was possible, she'd make contact the next day without fail. We'd been doing this for years. By the evening of September 22nd, with no word from her sister, Rebecca called Whispering Pines Resort. Thomas Kirkland agreed to check on Cabin 7. Nothing seemed obviously wrong at first, Kirkland told police. Her car wasn't there, but that wasn't unusual, she was often out shooting until late. But when I knocked and got no answer, I used my master key to check inside. The bed hadn't been slept in. Her laptop was there on the table, open but in sleep mode. Her larger camera equipment cases were there, but no cameras. It looked like she'd stepped out expecting to return. On the morning of September 23rd, after a second night with no sign of Vanessa, Kirkland contacted the New York State Police. By that afternoon, Sergeant Ray Donovan was standing in Cabin 7, getting his first look at what would become one of the most perplexing cases of his 20-year career. Sergeant Ray Donovan was a 20-year veteran of the New York State Police with salt and pepper hair cropped short and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. At 52, he had handled numerous missing persons cases throughout the Adirondack region, hikers who strayed from trails, kayakers overturned in rapids, the occasional tourist who underestimated the wilderness. Most were found within days, some alive, some not. But something about Vanessa Mitchell's disappearance struck him differently from the beginning. The cabin was too orderly, he would later tell a colleague. Missing hikers, they usually leave signs of their intentions, maps marked with routes, notes about which trail they plan to take, appropriate gear missing from their belongings. Mitchell's cabin looked like she had just stepped out to get something from her car. The initial search focused on the resort grounds and the immediate surrounding area. Donovan's first break came when Vanessa's Subaru was discovered in the small parking area at the Cobble Mountain Trailhead, approximately 7 miles from Whispering Pines. The vehicle was locked, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. Inside, officers found a tripod, a light meter, and a small bag containing energy bars and a water bottle. "We expanded the search along the Cobble Mountain Trail system," Donovan explained in his case notes. Standard protocols for a missing hiker. But something wasn't adding up. Mitchell was an experienced outdoorswoman but hadn't signed the trail register. And according to resort owner Kirkland, she hadn't mentioned any plans to hike Cobble Mountain. As the search expanded, Donovan began interviewing other guests at Whispering Pines and employees at businesses Vanessa had visited. A pattern emerged of a woman focused on her photography project, methodically visiting and documenting the old Olympic facilities. She asked specifically about access to the old ski jump complex, recalled Jeff Warren, who worked at the Lake Placid Olympic Museum. Not the main jumps that are still maintained, but the original facilities from the 1932 Games. Those have been largely abandoned since the 80s, they're off-limits to the public due to safety concerns. I warned her about that, but she just smiled and said something about finding a way. The investigation took an intriguing turn when digital forensics specialist Lisa Chen examined Vanessa's laptop. Her search history in the days before her disappearance showed repeated queries about local legends associated with the Olympic facilities, Chen reported. Specifically, she had been researching something called The Watchman of the Woods and had accessed several articles about an unsolved disappearance from 1978, a college student named Brian Mercer who vanished while exploring the old jump complex. Donovan, initially skeptical of any connection to ghost stories or local legends, nonetheless followed this thread to its source. As dawn broke on September 26, the search for Vanessa Mitchell entered its third day. What had begun as a routine operation had expanded significantly, now involving over 60 personnel including state police, forest rangers, volunteer search and rescue teams, and K-9 units. The dense Adirondack forest presented significant challenges: thick underbrush, steep ravines, and terrain that seemed to swallow sound. Radio communications were spotty at best, requiring search teams to maintain visual contact or regroup at designated coordinates every 30 minutes. Searching the Adirondacks isn't like searching an open field, explained Forest Ranger Captain Sarah Morrison. You can pass within 10 feet of what you're looking for and never see it. The forest creates a kind of natural labyrinth. The K-9 teams had picked up Vanessa's scent from items provided by the resort owner: a sweater she had left hanging in the cabin closet, her pillowcase. The dogs followed her trail from the Cobble Mountain parking area for approximately half a mile along the main trail before veering unexpectedly east, away from the marked path and toward the old Olympic complex. The dogs were consistent, K-9 handler Michael Peters noted. All three teams independently followed the same direction, leading us to an area not covered in the initial search, an old equipment shed near the abandoned ski jump from the 1932 games. The shed, its weather-beaten boards gray with age, roof partially collapsed from years of heavy Adirondack snow, sat in a small clearing. Decades earlier, it had housed maintenance equipment for the jump facilities. Now it stood as a silent sentinel to forgotten glory, surrounded by encroaching forest. The dogs were highly agitated around the shed, Peters continued. But strangely, the scent trail seemed to stop there. It didn't lead away in any direction. It was as if she had simply vanished. A thorough search of the shed and surrounding area yielded no immediate clues. The ground was too compacted to show footprints, and years of leaf fall had created a thick layer of natural mulch that revealed no disturbances that could be definitively linked to recent human activity. But as the team prepared to move on to a new search area, Rookie Officer Kevin Blake made a discovery that would dramatically shift the investigation's direction. Approximately 30 yards from the shed, Blake noticed a hollow in an ancient oak tree. "I almost missed it," Blake would later report. "Just happened to shine my flashlight at the right angle to catch a reflection from inside the hollow." The reflection came from a small, weatherproof case containing a professional-grade memory card, the type used in high-end DSLR cameras like Vanessa's. Property records later confirmed it belonged to her. Digital forensics specialist Lisa Chen worked through the night to recover and analyze the images. By morning, she had discoveries to share with Sergeant Donovan that left them both deeply troubled. Most of the photos were what you'd expect: artistic shots of the abandoned facilities, playing with light and shadow, Chen explained. But the final sequence, timestamped 8:17 p.m. on September 20th, showed something disturbing. While the metadata indicated these were taken during daylight hours, the images were clearly shot at night. The photos in question showed the interior of what appeared to be the equipment shed, illuminated only by what seemed to be Vanessa's camera flash. But in the background of three images, partially obscured by shadows, was what appeared to be a figure, indistinct, but undeniably human-shaped. The most concerning aspect, Chen continued, was that the figure appeared in different positions in each photo, as if moving closer to the camera with each shot. But according to the timestamps, these photos were taken mere seconds apart. When morning broke on September 27th, Sergeant Donovan made two decisions that would define the investigation moving forward. First, he reclassified Vanessa's disappearance from a missing person case to a potential criminal investigation. Second, he decided to explore the local connection that Vanessa herself had been researching: the 1978 disappearance of Brian Mercer and the local legend of the Watchman of the Woods. The Lake Placid Public Library sits on Main Street, a handsome brick building from the early 1900s that houses not just books and periodicals but also the town's historical archives. It was here that Sergeant Donovan found himself on the afternoon of September 27th, across the table from Margaret Collins, the town historian for the past 30 years. "The Watchman of the Woods isn't just a ghost story," Collins explained, sliding across the table a folder containing yellowed newspaper clippings. It started as a very real position, the night watchman for the Olympic facilities in the 1920s and 30s. His job was to patrol the grounds, especially during construction and in the off-season, to prevent vandalism and theft. According to Collins, the legend began after the 1932 Winter Olympics. Several workers reported strange occurrences at the ski jump complex, tools moved from where they'd been left, unexplained footprints in fresh snow when no one was supposed to be on site, a persistent feeling of being watched. Over time, as the original facilities fell into disuse, the stories evolved, Collins continued. The watchman became less a man and more a presence, something that had somehow become part of the landscape itself, still guarding the abandoned places long after his job should have ended. Donovan, practical by nature and suspicious of supernatural explanations, pressed for more concrete connections. What about Brian Mercer? The college student who disappeared in 1978? Collins nodded soberly. That case changed how locals viewed the old facilities. Brian was a journalism student at SUNY Plattsburgh, working on a photo essay about abandoned Olympic architecture, not unlike your missing photographer. He came to Lake Placid alone in November 1978, checked into the Lakeside Motel, and was last seen heading toward the old jump complex with his camera equipment. Collins pulled out another file, this one containing the original missing person report and subsequent investigation documents that had been donated to the town archives. They searched for weeks. Found his car at the maintenance road that leads to the old jumps. Found one of his gloves on the path. But never found him or his camera equipment. The parallels with Vanessa's case were impossible to ignore. Donovan spent hours poring over the old case files, noting the similar circumstances but also the differences. Unlike Vanessa, Brian had explicitly told motel staff where he was heading. Unlike Vanessa, items of his clothing had been found along the trail. But both had been photographers, both had been documenting the old Olympic sites, and both had disappeared without clear evidence of what had happened. As Donovan prepared to leave, Collins handed him one final document, a list of names. These are people still living in the area who were involved in the original search for Brian Mercer. If anyone might have insights, it would be them. One name caught Donovan's attention immediately, Walter Breckman. Under his name, Collins had written, former maintenance worker, Olympic facilities 1972 to 1983. Discovered Brian's glove. Reluctant to discuss case. Walter Breckman lived in a small, well-maintained house at the edge of town, its yard meticulous despite the owner's advanced age. At 83, Breckman walked with a slight stoop but maintained the powerful build of someone who had spent decades in physical labor. His handshake was firm when he greeted Donovan at the door, but his eyes carried a wariness that deepened when the sergeant explained the purpose of his visit. "I figured someone would come asking again someday," Breckman said, ushering Donovan into a living room decorated with photographs of Lake Placid through the decades. "When I heard about the woman who went missing, history repeating itself." Initially, Breckman spoke in generalities, reminiscing about his years working at the Olympic facilities, the pride the town took in hosting the games twice, the changes he'd seen over the decades. But when Donovan gently steered the conversation toward Brian Mercer's disappearance, the old man's demeanor changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, hands that couldn't quite stay still. "I found his glove," Breckman finally acknowledged. "During the search. It was on the path leading to the 32 jump, just lying there like it had been placed, not dropped. Too neat." He paused, seeming to debate how much to share. "There's things about those old facilities that don't make sense, Sergeant. Areas where compasses don't read right. Places where sound carries in ways it shouldn't. The old-timers who built the original jumps, they used to talk about it." Donovan pressed carefully, "And the watchman? The stories about someone still guarding the abandoned areas?" Breckman's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, a glance toward the window as if checking who might be listening. "Not someone," he said finally, voice lowered. "Something. There was a night watchman back in the early days, Gregory Blackwood. Mean sort of man by all accounts. Took his job too seriously. Story goes he fell from the jump tower in 34 during an inspection. Died instantly. After that is when the strange report started. Donovan spent nearly 2 hours with Breckman, carefully separating potential facts from folklore. What emerged was a clearer picture of locations within the old complex that had been associated with unusual occurrences over the decades, primarily centered around the 1932 jump and its auxiliary buildings. As Donovan prepared to leave, Breckman gripped his arm with surprising strength. "If you're going back out there to search, go before dark. Nothing good happens at those old jumps after sunset." The sergeant departed with mixed feelings, frustration at the supernatural bent of Breckman's account, but also a growing certainty that the abandoned Olympic facilities held the key to Vanessa's disappearance. That certainty was reinforced the following morning, day 14 of the search, when hiker Daniel Cooper contacted authorities with a discovery made miles from the primary search area. While exploring a remote trail rarely used except by the most dedicated hikers, Cooper had found a weathered page torn from a notebook, partially protected from the elements by the rock overhang where it had become wedged. The handwriting was later confirmed to be Vanessa's, the paper matching a notebook missing from her cabin. The content, though partially degraded by exposure, sent a chill through the investigation team. Third day at the jump complex. Getting incredible shots of the decay, the way nature is reclaiming the structures. But something feels off here. Someone is watching from the trees. Not following exactly, but always ahead of me somehow, as if anticipating where I'll go next. Tried to tell myself it's just nerves from working alone, but today I found my tripod moved from where I left it yesterday. Someone else is definitely out here. Going to finish shooting the interior of the equipment shed, then think I should probably. The entry ended there, the rest of the page blank. The location where Cooper found the page was roughly 3 miles northeast of the abandoned jump complex, not on any direct route back to Whispering Pines or the Cobble Mountain parking area where Vanessa's car had been found. This discovery coincided with forensic results from analysis of soil samples taken from the floor mats of Vanessa's Subaru. Dr. Maria Hernandez, the state forensic botanist who examined the samples, found something unexpected. In addition to the expected soil composition for the Adirondack region, we identified traces of chemical compounds consistent with those used in taxidermy, specifically, borax and arsenic compounds that would be used in older preservation techniques, not modern methods. This finding prompted Sergeant Donovan to expand background checks on individuals associated with the Olympic facilities or who lived in the vicinity of the abandoned complex. One name emerged that connected multiple threads: Gregory Blackwood Jr., son of the night watchman Walter Breckman had mentioned. Unlike his father who had died in the 1930s, Blackwood Jr. was very much alive, 76 years old and living in a remote cabin approximately 5 miles from the old jump complex. Records showed he had worked maintenance for the Olympic facilities from 1975 to 1980 but had resigned shortly before the Winter Games. More concerning to Donovan was the discovery that Blackwood had been questioned in connection with 2 other missing persons cases in the region during the early 1990s, hikers who had disappeared in areas where he was known to hunt. In both cases, lack of evidence had prevented any charges. The morning of October 3 dawned cold and clear, the autumn colors now at their peak throughout the Adirondacks, a stark contrast to the grim determination of the team that assembled at the State Police Command Post. Armed with search warrants and accompanied by tactical units, Sergeant Donovan prepared to approach Gregory Blackwood's remote property. "We're treating this as a high-risk warrant execution," he briefed the assembled officers. "Subject has no record of violent crime, but given the circumstances and isolation of the location, we're proceeding with maximum caution." Blackwood's cabin, when they finally reached it after a 40-minute approach through dense forest, appeared deceptively ordinary: a well-maintained log structure with a metal roof, solar panels mounted nearby, a neat woodpile stacked against one wall. No vehicles were visible, no smoke rose from the chimney despite the morning chill. After announcing their presence and receiving no response, the tactical team made entry, quickly determining that Blackwood wasn't on the premises. What they found inside, however, transformed the investigation. The main living area was ordinary enough, Donovan would later report. Clean, organized, nothing immediately suspicious. It was the locked room off the back hallway that changed everything. Behind that locked door lay what could only be described as a shrine to the abandoned Olympic facilities, walls covered with photographs spanning decades, meticulous logbooks documenting activity at the sites, and most disturbing of all, a collection of items that Donovan immediately recognized as belonging to missing persons, a watch that matched the description of one Brian Mercer had been wearing in 1978, a hiking boot consistent with those worn by one of the missing hikers from the 1990s. And sitting on a small table, unmistakable with its distinctive strap, Vanessa Mitchell's camera. But Blackwood himself wasn't there. And beneath a hinged trapdoor in the floor of this room, officers discovered a narrow set of stairs leading to a cellar that Donovan would later describe as something from a nightmare. The cellar contained clear evidence connecting Blackwood to 3 disappearances, including Vanessa's. Her backpack, water bottle, and the missing notebook were found carefully arranged on a shelf, alongside similar items presumably belonging to the other victims. Forensic technicians would spend days processing the scene, but even their trained professionalism couldn't entirely mask their horror at what the evidence suggested had occurred in that underground room. With Blackwood now the subject of a region-wide manhunt, Donovan returned to what they now knew had been the focal point of his obsession, the abandoned ski jump complex. Something kept drawing him back there, Donovan reasoned. And from what we found in his cabin, it seems the place held some kind of ritualistic significance for him. The search team that assembled at the old jump complex on October 4th was the largest yet, over 100 personnel including K-9 units, tactical teams, and even civilian volunteers who knew the area intimately. They began a methodical grid search focusing on the structures Blackwood had documented most extensively in his logs. It was near sunset when the search took its final unexpected turn. Officer Blake, who had found the memory card 13 days earlier, was searching with his K-9 partner near the base of the 1932 jump when the dog became agitated, pulling strongly toward an area of disturbed ground partially hidden by fallen leaves. What they found was not Vanessa Mitchell, as many had feared, but Gregory Blackwood himself, deceased from what appeared to be a self-inflicted wound. Beside his body lay a handwritten note, its contents so disturbing that Donovan initially restricted access to it even among the investigative team. I returned to where it began, the note read in part. Where my father showed me the true nature of the watchman's duty. The obligation passes from keeper to keeper. I have served faithfully, protecting these grounds from trespassers, preserving their memory as they preserved mine. But I grew old, grew weak. Failed in my duty to properly induct a successor. The woman photographer would have understood eventually, would have seen the patterns as I showed her the others who came before. But she fought too hard, saw too much. The watchman's legacy ends with me, returning to the place of my father's sacrifice. The case of Vanessa Mitchell and its connection to disappearances spanning decades became one of the most extensively studied in New York State police history. Gregory Blackwood's property yielded evidence that eventually helped identify remains found in remote areas of the Adirondack Park, bringing closure to 3 families whose loved ones had vanished over the years. Vanessa's camera and final photographs became part of training materials used by the FBI for cases involving stalking and predatory behavior. The images she captured in her final days, beautiful, haunting visions of abandoned glory, were published posthumously in the book her sister Rebecca completed, titled What Remains, rather than Vanessa's original working title. The abandoned ski jump complex was finally demolished in 2009, the decision accelerated by the grim discoveries associated with it. In its place stands a simple memorial, a photographer's tripod cast in bronze, with a plaque bearing the names of those whose lives were cut short there. For the residents of Lake Placid, the case faded into local history, discussed occasionally by longtime locals, mentioned in hushed tones when the conversation turns to the darker chapters of the town's past. The story of the watchman evolved once more, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and obsession. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the wind moves through the trees where the old jump once stood, visitors report a strange sensation, not quite a sound, not quite a presence, but a persistent feeling that someone is there, watching from just beyond the edge of vision. For Sergeant Ray Donovan, who retired the year after closing the case, the investigation left lingering questions that technical evidence and logical deduction couldn't entirely resolve. In 23 years of police work, I encountered plenty of disturbed individuals, plenty of tragedy, he reflected in a rare interview years later. But something about the Blackwood case never sat right with me. The precision of his records, the ritualistic aspects of his behavior, his absolute conviction that he was continuing some kind of legacy, it makes you wonder what he experienced that twisted him so thoroughly. The abandoned Olympic sites that remain in Lake Placid continue to draw photographers and urban explorers, despite increased security and warnings posted at access points. Most come for the same reasons that drew Vanessa Mitchell, to capture the poignant beauty of places where moments of human triumph have given way to quiet decay. But they come in daylight. And they rarely come alone. Rest easy now, knowing that whatever truth lies behind the story of Vanessa Mitchell and the Watchmen of the Woods, justice was ultimately served, though too late for Vanessa and others who crossed paths with darkness hiding in beautiful places. Story 4. Whispering Pines, Washington isn't found on most maps. Technically an unincorporated community within Pierce County, it sits nestled in a valley about 30 miles southeast of Tacoma, surrounded by the kind of towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that gave the Pacific Northwest its reputation for primeval beauty. The community took its name from the sound the wind makes as it passes through the dense pine forests that blanket the surrounding hills, a constant, gentle susurration that residents eventually stop hearing consciously but notice immediately when it's absent. In the winter of 1997, when our story takes place, Whispering Pines was home to just under 800 people. Most worked either for Cascade Timber, the logging operation that had sustained the community since the 1920s, or commuted to larger towns for employment. It was the kind of place where generations of families lived within miles of one another, where everyone knew not just your name but your grandparents' names, and where the same families had occupied positions of influence for as long as anyone could remember. The town center, such as it was, consisted of a single main street, Pine Avenue, with a post office, a general store that doubled as the gas station, a diner called the Loggers' Rest, and a small library housed in what had once been the town's first schoolhouse. The nearest police station was in Mineral, 12 miles away, though Sheriff Daniel Harmon made a point of driving through Whispering Pines at least twice a week, more out of social obligation than any expectation of trouble. Winter comes early to this part of Washington. By late November, the mountains that ring the valley were already capped with snow, and morning frost painted the town in crystalline white. The logging operations slowed during these months, with crews focusing on maintenance and processing rather than active cutting. The pace of life in Whispering Pines shifted accordingly, more time spent indoors, more community gatherings at the local church hall, more attention paid to the comings and goings of others simply because there was less else to observe. It was against this backdrop of close-knit community life and long winter shadows that Rebecca Lawson returned to Whispering Pines after an absence of nearly 20 years. Rebecca Lawson had left Whispering Pines in the summer of 1978, exactly 1 week after graduating high school, with nothing but a duffel bag of clothes and enough money saved from part-time work at the Loggers' Rest to buy a bus ticket to Seattle. She had not returned for her father's funeral in 1983, nor for her mother's in 1989. As far as most residents knew, she had severed all ties with the town that had raised her, until the morning of November 18, 1997, when she stepped off the county bus at the Pine Avenue stop, now a woman of 37 with streaks of gray in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. She didn't look like somebody coming home, Martha Wilson, who had been collecting mail at the post office when the bus arrived, would later recall. She looked like somebody reporting for a duty they'd been dreading. Rebecca checked into the Whispering Pines Lodge, the town's only accommodation for travelers, a modest building with 8 rooms that catered primarily to the occasional fishing enthusiast or hiker exploring the less-traveled paths around Mount Rainier. She paid in cash for 2 weeks in advance, telling the proprietor, Jack Emerson, that she was taking care of family business, but offering no further explanation. Over the next few days, Rebecca established a routine that quickly became the subject of local curiosity. Each morning, she would breakfast at the Loggers' Rest, exchanging minimal pleasantries with anyone who approached her. She would then spend hours at the county records office in the back of the library, poring over property deeds, town council minutes, and old newspapers preserved on microfiche. Afternoons would find her walking the town's residential streets with a small notebook in hand, occasionally pausing to make notes or take photographs with a compact camera. Evenings, she would return to the lodge, taking dinner in her room rather than at the diner where questions might accompany the meatloaf. She was looking for something, Linda Peterson, the town librarian since 1985, observed. I offered to help, told her I knew the archives better than anyone, but she just smiled that tight little smile and said she preferred to do her research alone. What most residents of Whispering Pines didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Rebecca Lawson was no longer the 17-year-old girl who had fled their town all those years ago. She was now Dr. Rebecca Lawson, a forensic anthropologist with the University of Washington, specializing in the identification of human remains and the determination of time and cause of death. Her return to Whispering Pines was not a sentimental journey but a professional one, though deeply personal as well, in ways that would soon become clear to everyone. The story of what brought Rebecca Lawson back to Whispering Pines began not in the town itself but 300 miles away in Portland, Oregon, in the office of Detective Marcus Ellison of the Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Unit. On his desk sat a file that had been opened in April of 1978 and never officially closed, the disappearance of 16-year-old Stephanie Carmichael. Stephanie had vanished on April 12, 1978, while returning from a weekend visit to her grandmother in Vancouver, Washington. The Greyhound bus she was traveling on had made a scheduled stop in the Tacoma Transit Center, where surveillance cameras captured her disembarking at 3:17 p.m. She never reboarded, and the bus continued its route to Portland without her. Stephanie Carmichael was never seen again. The investigation at the time had been thorough but ultimately fruitless. Stephanie had no known connections in Tacoma, no reason to disembark there other than perhaps to use the restroom or purchase refreshments. Witnesses remembered a pretty teenage girl with blonde hair, but no one recalled seeing her leave the transit center or interact with anyone suspicious. Her parents, both educators at a Portland high school, could think of no one who would wish to harm their daughter. As weeks turned to months with no ransom demands and no sightings, the case gradually cooled, becoming one of dozens of missing persons files that gathered dust in police archives. What changed in October of 1997 was the discovery of human remains by a survey crew mapping a proposed expansion of Cascade Timber's logging operations in the forests outside Whispering Pines. Buried beneath a fallen tree estimated to have collapsed at least 15 years earlier were the partial skeletal remains of a young female. Initial forensic examination suggested the remains had been in that location for approximately 20 years, and items found with the body, a silver bracelet with a musical note charm and fragments of clothing consistent with late 1970s fashion, prompted the Pierce County Sheriff's Department to contact other agencies about missing persons cases from that era. When the details reached Detective Ellison's desk in Portland, he immediately pulled the Carmichael file. The bracelet description matched one Stephanie had been known to wear, a 16th birthday gift from her grandmother just months before her disappearance. But the location made little sense. Whispering Pines was miles from any route Stephanie would logically have taken, requiring deliberate travel from Tacoma through rural back roads. It was at this point that Dr. Rebecca Lawson became involved. As one of the foremost forensic anthropologists in the Pacific Northwest, she was consulted to conduct a detailed examination of the remains. What she didn't reveal to Detective Ellison or the Pierce County authorities was her own connection to Whispering Pines, or why the date of Stephanie Carmichael's disappearance had caused her blood to run cold when she first reviewed the file. April 12, 1978. Rebecca knew exactly where she had been that day. She knew exactly who she had been with. And she had spent nearly 20 years trying to forget what she had seen. Rebecca's work in the county records office quickly yielded the information she sought. Property records from 1978 showed that Cascade Timber had purchased 300 acres of forest land from a private owner in March of that year, Richard Blackwood, who had served as the company's operations manager from 1965 until his sudden retirement in 1979. The land where Stephanie Carmichael's remains were discovered fell within that purchase. The timing wasn't coincidental. Nothing about this case was coincidental, Rebecca knew. But proving what she suspected would require more than old property deeds and her own painful memories. On her fourth day in Whispering Pines, Rebecca broke from her routine. Instead of spending the afternoon walking the residential streets, she drove the rental car she'd picked up in Tacoma to a property at the edge of town, a well-maintained cedar-sided house set back from the road, partially obscured by towering pines. The mailbox read Blackwood in faded letters. Margaret Blackwood, now 72 and widowed for 5 years, initially seemed confused by the appearance of her visitor. But as recognition dawned, her expression shifted from puzzlement to something more complex, a mixture of fear and resignation. "Becky Lawson," she said softly, using the childhood name no one had called Rebecca in decades. "I wondered if someone would come back eventually. Though I never thought it would be you." Over tea served in delicate cups that seemed at odds with the gravity of their conversation, Rebecca laid out what she knew and what she suspected. The remains found in the woods. The timing of Richard Blackwood's land sale to Cascade Timber. The connections to Stephanie Carmichael. "Your husband worked at the Tacoma Transit Center before he came to Whispering Pines, didn't he, Mrs. Blackwood?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer from her research. From 1971 to 1975, he was a security supervisor there. Margaret Blackwood's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. "Richard was a good man," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He provided for his family. He was respected in this community." "I'm not here to destroy anyone's reputation," Rebecca replied carefully. "But a young girl's family has spent almost 20 years wondering what happened to their daughter. They deserve to know the truth." The conversation that followed would later be entered into official records, accompanied by Margaret Blackwood's signed statement. Richard Blackwood, she revealed, had indeed worked security at the Tacoma Transit Center before being hired by Cascade Timber. During those years, he had developed what his wife euphemistically called inappropriate interests in young women. She had hoped the move to Whispering Pines would put distance between him and temptation, had believed his promises that he had changed. But then there was that girl in the spring of '78, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard said it was an accident, that she'd threatened to report him for approaching her at the bus station. He said he'd only meant to scare her, but things went wrong. According to Margaret, Richard had used his knowledge of back roads and logging trails to transport Stephanie's body to the remote property he owned outside Whispering Pines. He had buried her deep in the woods, then sold the land to Cascade Timber mere weeks later, ensuring it would become restricted property with limited access. He was never the same after that, Margaret continued. Started drinking heavily. Became paranoid. Kept saying someone had seen him with the girl, that it was only a matter of time before they came forward. As Margaret Blackwood spoke, Rebecca's mind traveled back to an April evening in 1978. She had been 17, restless in the way only teenagers in small towns can be, sneaking out after her parents were asleep to meet her boyfriend, Thomas Gray, for a late-night drive. Their favorite spot was an overlook off one of the logging roads, where the lights of the valley spread out below them like fallen stars. But that night, they had taken a wrong turn, ending up on a rarely used fire road that cut through Richard Blackwood's property. It was there they had seen the pickup truck parked deep among the trees, its headlights off but interior light glowing faintly. It was there they had seen Richard Blackwood, a man they both knew as a pillar of the community, emerging from the woods with a shovel in his hands, stopping short when their headlights illuminated him. Thomas had reversed quickly, mumbling apologies about being lost. Richard had said nothing, just stood there, his face unreadable in the harsh crossbeam of the headlights. They had driven back to town in silence, both understanding that they had witnessed something they were not meant to see but neither fully comprehending its significance. The next day, when Thomas suggested they tell someone, Rebecca had balked. Richard Blackwood was friends with her father, was on the town council, donated generously to school functions. Who would believe two teenagers known for causing minor trouble? What had they really seen, anyway? A man with a shovel on his own property, hardly evidence of wrongdoing. So they had kept quiet. 2 weeks later, when posters about a missing girl from Portland appeared on the community bulletin board outside the general store, featuring a school photograph of a smiling blonde teenager, Rebecca had felt a cold knot form in her stomach. But still, she said nothing. By summer's end, Rebecca had left Whispering Pines behind, heading for Seattle and eventually the University of Washington. Thomas had stayed, taking a job with Cascade Timber, eventually becoming a crew foreman. They had not spoken since the night before her departure, a painful conversation where she had begged him to come with her and he had refused, unable to imagine a life beyond the only community he had ever known. Now, 19 years later, Rebecca needed to speak with Thomas again. If her suspicions were correct, if the remains in the woods were indeed those of Stephanie Carmichael, and if Richard Blackwood was responsible for her death, then she and Thomas were the unwitting witnesses who might finally bring closure to a family's decades-long nightmare. Finding Thomas Gray proved simpler than Rebecca had anticipated. He was still in Whispering Pines, still working for Cascade Timber, now as the operations manager, ironically, the same position Richard Blackwood had once held. The Loggers' Rest Diner, where he ate lunch most days according to the waitress who had recognized Rebecca on her first morning in town, seemed the logical place for their reunion. Thomas was in his usual booth when Rebecca entered, his weathered face momentarily frozen in shock as he registered her presence. At 37, he had maintained the strong physique of his youth, though his once dark hair was now sprinkled with gray, and deep lines framed eyes that had seen more of life than he had perhaps expected when choosing to remain in Whispering Pines. "I heard you were back in town," he said as she slid into the seat across from him. "Figured you'd find me sooner or later." "You know why I'm here," Rebecca replied, not a question but a statement. Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "The body they found in the old Blackwood parcel. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection." Over the next hour, as Thomas's untouched coffee grew cold and Rebecca's remained ordered but undelivered, they reconstructed the events of April 12, 1978, and the following days. Thomas confirmed what Rebecca already knew, that they had witnessed Richard Blackwood engaged in suspicious activity on the very night Stephanie Carmichael disappeared. But then he shared something Rebecca hadn't known, something he'd carried alone for 19 years. "I went back," he admitted, voice low with the weight of confession. "The next day, while you were in school. I told my dad I was sick and doubled back to that same spot once the house was empty. I don't know what I expected to find, maybe reassurance that it was nothing sinister, just Blackwood doing some late-night landscaping or something equally innocent. What Thomas found instead was disturbed earth partially covered with pine branches, and nearby, half hidden under a fallen log, a small silver bracelet with a musical note charm. He had pocketed the bracelet, uncertain of its significance but troubled by its presence, and returned home more confused than before. When the missing girl posters went up with her picture and description, they mentioned a silver bracelet, Thomas continued. I knew then what I'd found, what Blackwood had done. But I was 18, from a nobody family, and he was Richard Blackwood. My dad's job depended on Cascade Timber. Everyone respected Blackwood. Who would believe me against him? And then there was the bracelet. By taking it, I'd tampered with whatever it was. A crime scene, I guess. You still have it, Rebecca said, again not a question. Thomas nodded. Locked in my father's old gun safe all these years. Never worn, never touched after that day. I didn't know what else to do with it. Rebecca explained her current role in the investigation, the forensic work she was doing, and the statement she had obtained from Margaret Blackwood. With Thomas's testimony and the physical evidence of the bracelet, they had enough to formally link Richard Blackwood to Stephanie Carmichael's disappearance and death. It won't bring her back, Rebecca acknowledged. And it won't undo our silence all those years ago. But her family deserves to know what happened to her. They deserve that peace, at least. The formal investigation that followed over the next several weeks was thorough and methodical. Detective Marcus Ellison traveled from Portland to coordinate with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department. Dr. Rebecca Lawson continued her forensic examination of the remains, now positively identified through dental records as those of Stephanie Carmichael. Thomas Gray surrendered the silver bracelet and provided a detailed statement about what he had witnessed and discovered in April 1978. Margaret Blackwood's cooperation proved invaluable, as she revealed not only what her husband had confessed to her about Stephanie Carmichael but also her suspicions about two other young women who had gone missing along bus routes between Tacoma and Portland during Richard's time working at the transit center. Although Richard had died in 1992, investigators were able to build a compelling case linking him to three disappearances between 1973 and 1978. For the Carmichael family, the resolution brought a mixture of grief and relief. John and Patricia Carmichael, now in their 70s, had never given up hope of discovering what happened to their daughter, though they had long ago accepted they would likely never see her alive again. When Detective Ellison presented them with Stephanie's silver bracelet, Patricia had clutched it to her chest and whispered, "She loved this so much. Her grandmother gave it to her for her 16th birthday." The story received modest coverage in the Seattle Times and Portland Oregonian, a cold case solved after nearly 2 decades, bringing closure to a family's long nightmare. Larger outlets briefly noted it as part of feature stories on advances in forensic science and the resolution of historical crimes. In Whispering Pines itself, the reaction was more complex: shock among younger residents who had only known Richard Blackwood as a name on community center donor plaques, quiet vindication among those who had sensed something beneath his carefully maintained public persona, and a collective reckoning with the knowledge that darkness had existed in their midst, unacknowledged and unchallenged. For Rebecca Lawson, the case's resolution brought professional satisfaction but personal complications. Her role in identifying the remains and providing context for the historical investigation earned commendation from her colleagues at the University of Washington. But her return to Whispering Pines had reopened wounds she had spent years trying to heal: the guilt of her silence, the weight of complicity, however unwitting, in allowing Richard Blackwood to escape justice during his lifetime. On a cold December morning, 3 weeks after formally concluding her work on the Carmichael case, Rebecca Lawson returned once more to Whispering Pines. This time, she came not as a forensic anthropologist or a witness, but as that rarest of things, a former resident making peace with the place that had shaped her. She parked her car on Pine Avenue and walked through town, noting how little had changed in some ways and how much in others. The general store had been remodeled, but the bell above the door still jangled in the same pitch she remembered from childhood. The Loggers' Rest had new booths, but the coffee was still served in the same thick white mugs. The library had computers now, but the same creaky floorboard announced visitors at the entrance. Thomas was waiting for her at their old spot, the overlook where teenage Rebecca and Thomas had parked on countless evenings, looking down at the valley below. They stood side by side in comfortable silence for several minutes, their breath clouding in the winter air, before Thomas spoke. "I keep thinking about parallel lives," he said. "If we had spoken up back then. If I had gone with you to Seattle. If Blackwood had been caught. How many things would be different now?" "We can't know," Rebecca replied. "All we have is what we did do, eventually. It took too long, but we did the right thing in the end." They had met with the Carmichael family together the previous day, a meeting arranged by Detective Ellison after John and Patricia had expressed a desire to thank those who had helped solve their daughter's case. It had been difficult but cathartic, two sets of people whose lives had been altered by the same act of violence finding connection in their shared experience of its aftermath. "I'm not staying," Rebecca said, answering the question Thomas hadn't asked. "My life is in Seattle now." "My work?" Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "And I'm not leaving. This town, it's still home, despite everything. Someone needs to remember what happened here, to make sure it's not forgotten or papered over with time." Before departing Whispering Pines for what she suspected might be the final time, Rebecca visited the small memorial that had been placed at the town's community center, a simple plaque acknowledging Stephanie Carmichael and pledging that the community would strive to protect the vulnerable and speak truth to power. It wasn't much, this small bronze rectangle, against the enormity of a life cut short. But it was something, an acknowledgement, a promise, a reminder. As Rebecca drove away from Whispering Pines, watching the town recede in her rearview mirror until it was obscured by the towering pines that gave it its name, she felt the weight of silence lifting. Some secrets, she had learned, are too heavy to carry alone. Some truths demand to be spoken, even when delayed by years or decades. And sometimes, it is only in returning to where our stories began that we find the strength to change their endings. In the years that followed, Rebecca would occasionally receive updates from Thomas about life in Whispering Pines. The town had established a scholarship in Stephanie Carmichael's name for local students pursuing careers in public service. Cascade Timber had set aside the land where her remains were found as a protected area. Most significantly, the community had instituted an annual Day of Truth each April, dedicated to encouraging open discussion of difficult topics and ensuring that silence would never again enable darkness to thrive in their midst. As for the Carmichael family, they finally held a proper funeral for their daughter in Portland in February 1998, laying to rest not just Stephanie's remains but the agonizing uncertainty that had defined their lives for nearly 20 years. Patricia Carmichael, in a gesture that brought Rebecca to tears when she learned of it, had placed the silver musical note bracelet in the casket with her daughter, returning to Stephanie in death what had been taken from her in life. Some cases are never truly closed, even when the files are archived and the investigators move on to new assignments. They live on in the hearts and minds of those they touched, rippling outward through time in ways impossible to measure or predict. The case of Stephanie Carmichael, the secrets of Whispering Pines, and the long-delayed justice that finally emerged would continue to shape lives long after the headlines faded and the rain washed away the last physical traces of what had occurred in those woods so many years ago. Rest easy now, knowing that while justice may sometimes be delayed, the truth has a way of finding its voice, even in the quietest of places. Even in Whispering Pines. Our background sounds will carry you into tranquility as you drift toward sleep. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.